Join us for Hegel now.
Yeah, I forgot about the part.
Recording in progress.
Yep, there it is.
Okay. All right, I just extended an invitation to Doug just in case he just wants to listen in. Because this is actually one of the easier sections if you really look at it. And, I got to reading Ben Burgis's latest missive about what David Harvey gets wrong about the analytic Marxists. He just dropped an article, I guess, in Jacobin or on his Substack, basically talking about how Harvey, misinterprets the analytic Marxists and what they really want to do, and how he insists on approaching Marx's Capital from a dialectic perspective. And of course, Burgess has a big problem with dialectic because he sees it in opposition to formal logic and common sense and he sides, of course, with the empiricists and the analytics. Um, and it just got me thinking about his sort of translation project. He insists that a translation is needed of what Marx is going on about for regular people. And what I don't think he gets is that Marx spent so much of his time trying to refine his reasoning in Capital, which is why there are several editions, including Engels' Marx assisted edition 3, of course, is because he was trying to um, make it so you didn't need dialectic training to read the damn thing. Okay. So he tried, all right, but the fingerprints are definitely still there. And, even if he tries, the fingerprints of the syllogism are on it. You have production, you have distribution, circulation, and consumption, and that itself is a regular syllogism. It's what Marx called a shallow syllogism, which means it was not absolute to the entirety of the dialectic of Capital, but it as a formal structure, it's pretty much how he organized the book. And so, some of the things that we are coming to read about in Hegel's Science of Logic in these two chapters, which I didn't actually read the two chapters. I read, um, sorry, I read what Harris had to say about
That's what I
the
read so far. Just about.
well, I read what Harris had to say about the essential relation, and don't worry, next time we're going to get to more of what Hegel actually says in these two chapters. But today I wanted to talk a little bit about um, the import of this, because when you're dealing with the relation of the whole and parts, what a translation project for the common man would mean in the hands of the analytics is that you would separate the whole and the parts from each other and try to hold them in isolation and abstraction. And I could be wrong. If Ben Burgers was here, he might tell me, no, 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 you misunderstand me. But um, as far as I read both Hegel and Harris, um, shit, hang on.
Yeah, I was about to say that was something brought up about Gödel's incompleteness theorem, because formal logic was trying to be all encompassing, kind of being able to self-referential. And Gödel's
Yeah.
incompleteness theorem straight up says proves that you can't do that. It always has to point to something external to it. So it's like
Yeah.
it formal logic is entirely incompletable.
And it's funny because when you get to the higher categories of um, force and expression, you find that you run into the contradictions that the analytics end up with, are just incomprehensible. You end up in tautologies. You end up saying the force is the force, right? Um, Without really expressing what it's made up of, right? Um, which I find just laughable. Um, because I mean, let me put it this way: when an expression of capital circuit occurs, okay, the mute compulsion behind its continual production and reproduction, right, is what pushes it on. But sometimes it's not always easy to quantify what that force looks like, as if it was sort of like a person. Like the ancients, especially the Christian ancients, looked at God as an unknowable force. And so it was easy for them to make the argument that if you just feel him in your heart, you will come to know God. And when you get out to Hegel's time or just before Hegel's time, you have people like Jacobi, Friedrich Jacobi, I think his name was, who argued exactly that you cannot reason what God is or what God does, and any attempt to is irrational. That you just have to feel Him through the immediate experience of life, and that's it.
Well, German Lutheranism, they had the Pietist movement, 18th century,
Yeah,
and that influenced me. And Kant's family were Pietists. And that's what Kant rebelled against. Even though Kant, on a more abstract level, accepted some of their ideas because, for Kant, God is really not provable because God is part of the noumenal realm,
yeah,
which is unknowable.
yeah, and yeah, exactly. And with this, um, that's eventually what prompted Hegel to uh, um, work with Holderlin and eventually with Schelling on the idea on the problems of faith and knowledge, which is actually the title of one of his early books, which appeared as an article or several articles of their journal, Schelling and Hegel's early journal in Jena, and dealt with the uh, why knowledge has to be approached from a rationalist perspective, and this opposed to that of faith, which is totally. I mean, it's like it's like well, what we were just saying. What does the force consist of? If it's in isolation and it's sort of external to the system. Well, we can't know. Say the theologians, whereas Hegel says, well, there are expressions of reality everywhere, that point to a cause, which um, in his system is actually an aggregate of parts, which make up a whole, right? That whole drives that force that creates those expressions. In Marx's case, the whole of capitalism um, has to be presupposed in order for the commodity to act the way it does within the system, so on and so forth. So, yeah, approaching this section of the logic from the point of view of seeing how we see reality and just sort of the immediate sense and trying to make sense of it, things are presented in a linear fashion, and that's why these things look like opposites, look like antinomies, when actually they're unities of opposites that articulate a greater um, well, I mean, the whole of reality, I guess you could say.
I just feel like they're like the two poles of another dimension of reality. They're kind of defining another dimension, both positive and negative directionally, of yet another description of reality, right? It's like being and nothing that defines something. Now you have determinate being, which itself
Well,
is, yeah, that's how I've been picturing each and every.
um, yeah, those are the accents that
Yeah,
that define what determines it. But in this section on appearance, you're really getting into, and this is exactly what Hegel says in here. You're getting into the phenomenological area where we humans look around and we see appearance everywhere. We see experience, we see phenomenons happening around us, and how do they look to us according to different measuring sticks of experience. You know, you read the entire phenomenology of spirit, and he goes through every shape of experiential phenomenology that the human looks around and you know confronts. And while those are shapes of experiences, here the relation of the parts to the whole, form and content, force in its expression, the inner and the outer, articulate the scientific categorical um, forms, moments that we experience in their uh, um, in a scientific appraisal. Like essence, especially in this section, is the scientific appraisal of what previously were regarded as phenomenological shapes. Does that make sense? And that's why there's a lot of overlap between this part of the phenomenology and or the whole of the phenomenology, especially. Um, oh, don't get me lying. What was Alex telling me? Alex was telling me go read the Force and Understanding, and you'll get right into what force and its expression are, the inner and the outer, the form and content, the whole and the parts, and why we in our experience see whole and parts as opposites or separate expressions when in fact they're meant to condition the same reality and are meant to be seen in conjunction, in correlation. That's the word that Errol Harris uses in his book. He says, once you start to see these seemingly separable categories as correlative right down the line, then it makes sense, right? Because you cannot construct a real concept in its fullness that takes account being and essence without whatever it is I just said, which I completely forgot just a second ago. I'm just having one of those nights where my brain just empties. Okay, that's what I got.
Yeah. So like wholes and parts, I remember it reminds me of a geneticist, Richard Lewontin wrote, well, he wrote many articles in the New York Review of Books on issues like that in relation to natural sciences. And his point was, a lot of scientists have tended to follow a reductionist way of doing science. Basically, you understand the wholes in terms of the parts. So their approach is to break the wholes down into the parts and to try to rebuild the whole from the parts, reducing the whole to the parts. And Lewontin took an exception to that approach.
Yeah.
He acknowledged that the reductionism did have No, it did make some valuable contributions, but it's not the only way of doing science. And that you need to do it. You need to do it in following a more holistic way of doing it as well.
Yeah.
Which basically is presumably well, I'm sure he had read Hegel, certainly had read Engels.
See, this is exactly why it's important to impart to folks reading Hegel, but more importantly, radicals who are trying to read Marx and trying to figure out, like, one of the things that unfortunately Stalinism left us with in this era, um, of post-Stalinist Marxism, is a feeling that science done the dialectic way and science done the bourgeois way are uh, at opposite poles, and you always have to shun the bourgeois side. And unfortunately, Hegel is completely obscured in that judgment, because Hegel says, and Marx said, that you have to investigate scientifically as before, but what you do with your findings is uh, what you do with your findings. You could use any taxonomic, any organizational system you like, but being able to order it dialectically, um, as Hegel showed us to do at the beginning of the book, with what must science begin. I mean, that essay, um, at the very beginning of the book, should be like text number 1 or 2 that every Marxist should read. And anyone within the sound of my voice, go and find yourself a copy of Hegel's Science of Logic, and go find the section called, sorry, I'm with what must the science begin, because it's here that he sets the tone for the entire book. Where should we begin? And Hegel proceeds by I mean, we've already read this part, but I'll just say it again. Hegel proceeds from his point of view by reviewing all of the past beginnings of philosophy, or philosophical systems that different uh, thinkers have had over the ages, and the uh, uh, not so much the problems with them, but what questions were left unanswered. And from there he starts from the most abstract, um, but which is also the whole, um, which is sheer being. If you end the phenomenology with a subject object called absolute knowing, where it's both thinking and the thoughts, what does that look like in its germ form? Well, he says it's just being, right? And everything unfolds from there. And so, that's, if you want to think about it, how to start the first mile of dialectic, there's no better method than to follow Hegel's advice in the opening of the Science of Logic, to try to order what you're going to do, where you're going to start. And now I've completely forgotten why I brought that up. I keep thinking about Burgess's article, and how, every time I read something from him, or from one of the analytics, or even from one of, the even from one of the more mainstream IS personalities, they always bring up the dialectic and then mention an aphorism about it, but they never actually talk about the mechanics. You want the mechanics, it's all here. This is your dialectic training. And even, and for good Trotskyists out there, Trotsky and his writings on the dialectic point directly to this book and says, there's no better training ground. You're not going to know what Marx is doing in Capital with much precision without getting, at least somewhat familiar with what it means to see the whole and the parts, to see the interpenetration of opposites, and why it's not only how but why it's important, and what you lose if you don't have that perspective, I guess you could say. Okay, that was a lot. I'm going to stop talking. I don't think I got to the inner and the outer. Um,
Say kind of did in Harris, and I guess it kind of just makes sense to transition from force and utterance or force and expression into inner or outer, because it shows that there is essentially the same thing, but one is has kind of the self inside, and one is relation to self, one is relation to other of the same same essence, right?
well, if you think about the difference between the expression of a lightning bolt and the force that causes it, and how when we try to talk about them, it ends up running into a tautology, and how you solve this by saying basically that the expression defines the force itself and should not be left out of the definition of it, right? You start to get into it, and he says right here on page 187, force in its expression in the form of the lightning bolt, seen as identical opposites, resolve themselves into inner and outer aspects of one and the same phenomenon, right? Suddenly it's no longer separate force causing expression, like with electricity and the lightning bolt. You have a one complete phenomenon which has an inner and an outer face to it. And I'll just keep reading. This category of inner and outer is the sublation of all the previous categories of appearance. Inner corresponds to ground, outer to existence, and their identity in the content which appears in the exertion of force. This content is the same in both aspects. Nothing appears which is not contained in the essence, and everything so contained is manifest in the appearance. Everything I just said, just throw it on as a sticky note onto the lightning bolt, and it suddenly makes so much sense. Inner is the aspect of reflection into self. Outer is reflection to other. So outer is the reflection to other. When we see the lightning bolt, it's reflecting itself at us. Okay. Inside it, it's reflecting into itself what it is, right? Both, you know what I mean? Being what it is, in other words. He always says reflection into self. It can be translated, among other things, to mean that it exists in and of itself. You know what I mean? Yeah. Each taken in abstraction, each taken in abstraction, the inner and the outer, is utterly opposed to the other, identity to difference. But as they are moments of a single form, each posited in abstraction is immediately the other. Being and nothing are immediately the other. Right? There's your swoop, right? That when contemplating the inner and the outer, when thinking about the lightning bolt, right? It's accent of being and nothing and becoming. In other words, the outer becomes inner and then it disappears, right? Outer becomes inner and disappears. Lightning, and then it's gone, right? Lightning, and then it's gone. Sorry, I sound like a crazy man, but that, you see the accent of what's sublated into it as far as existence of the thing is concerned. Does that make sense? If essence is held to be the mere inner of the thing, as it is in common sense, it is an abstraction which is external to its concrete content. In other words, it's like a photograph. You took a photograph of a lightning bolt and you said this is what electricity looks like, or this is what lightning looks like, right? But does that show the entire thing in its movement? No, it's just the static, one-sided picture of an entire phenomenon, right? Um, blah blah blah. Thus, the so-called inner heart of nature is said to be impenetrable by the finite mind. Garbage, really. The real internal constitution of the thing is unknowable, and so it is external to and excluded from its actual content, which then appears only as the external shell. And here Harris is talking about Kant's thing in itself that's unknowable. Like Kant would say that the force of the lightning bolt is unknowable. Hegel says, but part of its content is its expression, and so we do know it. We can know it through its expression and define the force that it is, and thus we get a picture of one phenomenon with an inner and outer. And that's the key to the transition, Kyle. Is that suddenly you have one thing defined by two aspects, as opposed to supposedly two things that are held in opposition previously. Does that make sense?
Well, I mean, yeah, that's a pretty common thing throughout this. So
Yeah. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. It repeats over and over. It's amazing how many times this repeats, but with different accents and different sort of imagery. I love it. Um, let's see here. The poet Goethe protests that nature is far from being so grudging, for the core and the shell are not separable, and what appears outwardly is the very inner essence itself. I mean, this is a very Spinozistic phrase. This is monism at its highest peak. Okay, and and he littered his entire literary oeuvre with ideas like this that are just majestic. It's why Goethe um, sat and read so much of Hegel that he did, all the way up and through Hegel's stay in Berlin, or was it somewhere else? It might have been Berlin, or it might have been before that. Might have been Heidelberg. Um, let's see. Harris goes
Goethe
on.
was a big admirer of Spinoza.
Yes. Yep. And he saw what Hegel was doing with Spinoza's, with Spinoza's essence, one could say, covertly, but, consciously. Um, as we go up the directional scale and our object becomes progressively more concrete, inner and outer reveal themselves as inseparable and indispensable aspects of one identical content. At the more abstract levels, they oppose each other and revert one into the other. Where the concept is merely implicit, what presents itself is mere being, an outer mechanical facade. When essence is degraded to a subjective idea, merely an inner, it remains external to that to which it is held to be essential. Right? In other words, it's held as a part away from the whole, as if it wasn't part of the whole. On the other hand, at the more concrete levels of human personality and society, it is obvious that a person's inner disposition is revealed only in outer conduct, and what is not so expressed cannot be credited to the agent, but remains irrelevant to his or her effective character. Accordingly, Hegel is led to expostulate against psychological historiography. And so is Trotsky. And so is Lenin. And so is Marx and Engels, for that matter. They all resist this sort of psychologism, each of them right to the last, for this very reason, which instead of accepting the deeds of world historical figures and their obvious significance, burrows beneath the surface to find ulterior motives as pretexts for besmirching and denigrating their achievements.
Mhm. It's like
In other words, their expressions define their force. You get it? Kind of cool, huh?
yeah, well, keep thinking that's kind of like, well, we kind of do want to know the inner a little bit because it's the inner and the outer combined. And I'm just trying to compare it to the way we focused on the um, categories of the period can reflect in how the people thinks. But it's not the same thing as what you just said is the separation of the inner to explain the outer rather than it's them, I guess, existing together. That's kind of like raw thought, but I'm still trying to process.
Yeah. Well, ultimately, what's inner for us that we never bring expression to? I mean,
Yeah,
let me
yeah.
put it let me put it this way. If you go to your therapist and tell the therapist about all your inner things that you would do, but you have never done, right? Then that, of course, is admissible. But if they're thinking about killing everybody around them for their entire life, but they never dispatch one human being, can you really say that that's part of their character, even if that thought is inner but never outer?
Yep, it's the yeah, that's the distinction, right? We only care the stuff that matters is the stuff that actually occurs, not but
Well, well, proviso,
Yeah.
the thought occurs, and
right.
if we find the diary in which he says, "Here's my list of all the people that we kill," that can be part of the historiography, but it has to be noted that it remained inner and never outer
Right.
to get the full picture. But if I had those thoughts, but I never wrote them down, never told a soul, where are you going to find the the phenomenological evidence that it was uh, it might happen, right? There's nothing. It'd be like all these conspiracy theories, and
Hmm.
that I think is what Harris is getting at more, is that the so-called psychological historiography um, tries to explain ex post facto the uh, the influence of conditions on their actual history when you don't actually know. Like you're speculating, right? If the biographer tries to infer that he thought this and this and this, but there's no evidence of it, at that point you're just speculating about what they may or may not have thought. Is yeah.
I guess I didn't have any concrete that's a little more concrete examples than I was aware of on that, so that makes a lot more sense. I didn't realize pure speculating on okay. Got it.
I have the feeling he might touch on this a little bit in the philosophy of spirit, since he goes over psychology, for one thing, and phenomenological things in the human experience, I guess you could say. Okay, he goes on for another paragraph or so. He says, "What is merely implicit or potential in a child is external to him in the form of the authority and knowledge of his elders, and through education, drawing out, has to become internal to himself. Then, in the adult, what is internal, knowledge and experience, expresses itself outwardly, immediately in action. The imposition upon the criminal of punishment by an external authority is really the return of his own true conscience upon himself. At the very end of the logic in the absolute idea, as the final outcome of the dialectic, which actually I think the final outcome of the dialectic is the full syllogism: logic, nature, spirit. He didn't write just one book, he wrote three, to which he appended encyclopedic versions. The encyclopedia is a three-part syllogism. It's not just the one. If you get the German copy, and which I have it right here, it's one book with three parts: logic, nature philosophy, and spirit philosophy, or however he says it, right? And if you take them in syllogistic form, individual, particular to universal, and all of the different versions, you know what I mean? Uh, I think we read about this in Alex's class since we're already at the category, Kyle. But so if you take the logic as the mediating between spirit and nature, you've got that, right? If you take the logic as the intermediary between nature and spirit, you kind of see what he was building toward as far as the full absolute and what it actually looks like the full absolute syllogism, or what what does Harris complain about? If you open up the section on syllogism in the logic, he covers several forms of the syllogism. The one that's missing is the syllogism of the concept. It's not in there. There's the qualitative, which is the immediate. There is the reflective and the syllogism of the necessity. But there's no, both of which cover essence. Okay, those last two. The full and complete concept, Harris argues, is the full cycle of the encyclopedia. I'm not sure if this is actually borne out in the text. I've never read Philosophy of Spirit, so I don't know if he says that in there or if he says it somewhere. I would be interested to read it. I need to read all of Hegel, and that's going to take many, many more years. So yeah, stay tuned. Okay, where was I?
Hegel only lived in about 60.
Yeah. Oh, I know.
He got all the work done.
Yeah. Yeah. I would argue he got enough of the work done to give us a good, like, okay, shove you that way and get going. Even if not all of it may have been right. I'm sure he would have done revisions to the later parts later. Man, if he had only lived to like 80 or 90, that would have been like, all right, Okay, Harris says at the very end of the logic, in the absolute idea as the final outcome of the dialectic, we shall find that inner content and outer form are one and the same. They coalesce in the dialectical process itself, the absolute method, the subject matter of which is its very self, which, what else is he talking about? Thinking and thought. But at the level we have reached, the reversion of abstract inwardness and into abstract outwardness, and of the latter again into the former, reveals that their mere illusoriness, essence posited as a mere show, and also the actual concrete content in which they are immediately identical each with the other. This concrete identity is actuality. So here we see the transition into actuality from appearance, based on the outer and the inner, the dialectic of the outer and the inner. Kind of cool, huh?
It is. It's always just kind of hit me because I still haven't read phenomenology far enough yet. I'm like, what am I missing when it comes to seeing this section? I guess you're right. Kind of guide to that at the moment.
No, honey, it's milk. I'll be right back. I'm listening.
Oh, that's fine. Do still find it interesting. We're seeing the kind of the dance of being alongside essence throughout this entire process.
And Julian? Yes. Milk, brush teeth, and bed, please. Okay. Okay. Well, as he says, if you count the dialectic borne out in the philosophy and in the phenomenology of spirit, and see that subject object are one and the same, then you can't help but see throughout this entire process that being and thought are one and the same, which they are. They are from the beginning, and they are at the very end, at the absolute. there's never a point along the entire dialectic in which they're held apart, right? From being and nothing, uh, all the way up through form and content. Uh, um, I mean, yeah, and it's it's I I think it's the biggest drawback of the Anglo studies of Hegel that they put all the accent on thought and none of it on being. In fact, they often argue, oh, this is, this is just the categories of thought, the end, right? And
I think a lot of it is due to the British neo-Hegelians, because they read Hegel as very much an idealist.
yeah, they
And
put all the accent on the familiar categories that are found in the essence and the notion, but none of what comes out of being, because they don't actually see that that's foundational.
yeah, it's,
That existence itself is foundational to his entire system. Which is why, if you're going to be a Hegel scholar, you would better be a master of being before anything else. Otherwise, you're just missing the entire articulation of the rest of it.
thinking of British neo-Hegelianism, and that was the kind of thing that the early analytical philosophers were rebelling against. Was it? That's what Russell was rebelling against. That's what G.E. Moore was rebelling against, because that's
Yeah,
what they had studied at Cambridge or at Oxford or whatever.
yeah. And the urge to redefine being along Heideggerian or Nietzschean lines is basically what happened all the way down the line from the French to the English schools. So none of them actually take, the simple uh, M is as foundational to the whole thing. Um, they to me they all overcomplicate it, unfortunately, and I I don't know. It's a pet project of mine that someone has to bring being to uh, to radical Marxists. Well, I mean to Marxism in general. Okay, um, I think Marx carries it over just fine, but I don't think most readers. Um, I don't know. I think too many of them have taken the dogmatic forms, the sort of aphorisms that Engels left, and said, okay, well, this is what it is, when that's not the case at all. I'll be right back.
I still haven't read enough about Heidegger to even know what he said. Great. The more we read, the more I realize that I don't know.
And there's cases of Sartre. Sartre's existentialism was, at least in its earlier forms, was very individualistic. It always starts with the individual and reduces everything to the individual. Then later on, especially after he starts taking Marxism more seriously, he tries to develop a more dialectical version of it. And commentators on Sartre had long debated was he able to actually pull that off or not?
Yeah, I'm not terribly familiar with modern theory in the 20th century, and where I have read it, not much of it has penetrated my Anglo brain. And I think reading it forward after having read Hegel enough, I think it would make a lot more sense. But I think honestly, I would tear it the hell apart, root and branch, because a lot of it probably tries to tackle one side or the other of the equation of being in essence, and construct notions that are incomplete. I think that's the long and the short of it is all of the people who are so dedicated to the modern philosophers end up being terribly one-sided in one way or the other.
Because if I'm reading the shorthand for Heidegger's concept of being, because he considers being something that must be questioned and understood through the existential analysis of Dasein, emphasizing its temporal and historical nature, which sounds to me like a lot of idea of defining the struggle as in the moment to determine what to do, not any sort of structural, any logical structure. It's
Well,
pure existentialism, right?
well, it's taking the immediate and saying that you can make sense of things just from that, which
Right.
is if you look back and recall, that's Jacobi's argument, is that everything can be derived from the immediate. The love of God is immediately apparent to the deep feeling individual. You can feel God. He's in the air. You see some of these people with their hand in the air, like they're feeling God in the immediate moment. Never mind that the choir is singing, everybody else around them is doing the same thing, and those conditions are what's causing you to feel God. You see how that works? The sort of messianic. I'm going to get a whole lot of hate mail for this. I don't care. That messianic feeling doesn't come from an external source that's ineffable. It's all around you. When you sign up for one of these churches, that's why Pentecostal churches are so wildly successful when they get the right audience, is that, when they get enough people in the same room going, those conditions condition you, I guess you could say. And there's no rational explanation. Well, there's no rational explanation that they want you to make, and so they try to say that no rational explanation is possible. That's the heart of Friedrich Jacobi's whole system, I guess you could say, is that that's the case, and that's what Hegel actually argues against in Faith and Knowledge, which is his early book. He says it's garbage, and you should throw it out. But then later he becomes friends with Jacobi, and he learns to write strategically. There's a fire break between his and I think I mentioned this in Alex's class before, Kyle, but there's a fire break between Hegel's philosophical system and the conclusions he draws in public. Conclusions he draws in public must conform to the anti-Spinozist attitude in Greater Prussia. Okay, this is why you cannot trust what's written in the Science of Logic about, or the Encyclopedia about Spinoza, is because if you really look at it and compare, he just borrows Jacobi's estimation of Spinoza and uses that caricature to talk about Spinoza. So you're not going to get a true estimation of Spinoza in his mature works, because it would have ended his career, right? You can get a better glimpse of it in Faith and Knowledge, and that's Harrison's dissertation, by the way. Harrison Fluss wrote his dissertation on the true presentation of Spinoza through Hegel and faith and knowledge. Mm. Now, if I can only muster the continuous drive to write an article about all of this for people to access, that would be cool. That would be something.
Well, Marx was supposed to write a short essay explaining dialectics, but he never got around to doing it.
Yeah.
You can take up where Marx left off.
Assuming I live long enough to do it. But I honestly think enough of the finished product is available today to distill one. Thanks to people like Hoolgate, who illuminated being so expertly, I think. I keep having to read and reread this damn book. I mean, the logic, science of logic, and encyclopedia. It really is like a grammar for, I mean, everything, not just thought, but being. I really do sound like a zealot, but I don't mean to be an evangelist. I'm just trying to be like, all of this stuff is here if you just visit it in the right mode. You can't fully appreciate things like, say, force and expression without looking at the examples and realizing how they illuminate an explicit phenomenon. The explicit phenomenon of, say, lightning is illuminated, in the categories of force and expression, and even in the inner and the outer. And it highlights how we think about these things in the immediate sense, when we think it over, and when we construct concepts that talk about them. Because I really think that in the natural sciences, when we stop at the understanding, we end up with tautologies like, electricity and lightning. You know what I mean? Like, that's not a complete notion, right? If we had a complete notion about electricity and lightning, it would be a dialectical one. And that's what Marx constructed in Capital, a complete dialectical understanding of the commodity in its fullness, both in its material sense and in its sense in our heads, right? The mediated sense of the commodity is value, right? That's what's going on in our heads, right? We associate it with labor. We associate it with concrete labor, but also labor that we count, in terms of man hours and so forth. And these are things you cannot find. Like this mouse, you can't count how many man hours made this mouse. If you had access to the labor process, you could, right? Those are the trade secrets, right? But that and the material reality of the mouse are held separately, right? And we construct the fetish of the commodity out of imagining that the value is here materially somehow, when it's actually in here. It's the mediated portion. It's the essential portion. There you are. This stuff is not hard to understand. It's just people treat it like they're still in 101.
That's all they need to know, right?
Well, if you're writing for Jacobin, I guess that's the case. Sorry, I'm going to get a lot of hate mail for that too. I You know what I ought to do? I ought to send this YouTube as run-on sentence as it was to Ben Burgess's email box and see what he has to say. I'm sure he. Well, you know, if I have the feeling if he saw my point, he would ignore it. Do you know why? Because he makes a lot. He makes his living on the idea that the analytics can translate all of this. If I came along and burst his bubble, that's money that leaves his pocket. So maybe that's a cynical way of looking at it, but I've come to see academics that way. That if you come across with something that cuts the Gordian knot of something that they've built their life on, they don't tend to appreciate it. Yeah, I could be wrong. I don't know. What do you think? Do you think I should send it, or do you think it would just be a sort of a it would stay a provocation and nothing more?
I mean, how many emails do you think he gets regularly?
I'm sure he gets lots.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I don't know. Okay, well, it is 8:58, and I think I should point us to the next part of our reading. Um, Let me ask. So we've talked about the categories of appearance and the essential relation. It, you know, as Harris gave it. But do we want to take a second hack at appearance next week and talk
Yeah.
about Hegel's commentary?
Not to say, yeah.
Because I mean, he talks about well, his remarks, I should say, talk about things. Immediate identity of the inner and the outer is one. He sets up what the law of appearance itself is in the first part of the chapter, which Harris actually doesn't really cover that closely, and really, you know, really talks about the difference between the appearance and the outside world that is knowable, which Kant says isn't, right? And then when he gets into the whole and the parts, he talks about infinite divisibility. And it's interesting because this is a very Spinozistic notion. The idea of infinite attributes of substance, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that this is exactly, I think, what he's going on about. Let's see. Yeah. So, no new reading. Let's just go over appearance and the essential relation, basically looking at the remarks and just trying to fill in what we didn't talk about, and you know, and then we'll take it. And then the next week we'll assign actuality. How's that sound?
Yeah, sounds good. I can catch back up.
Yeah, same here. Because after reading Harris, I'm sufficiently oriented on appearance that I'm going to jet through this and say, okay, all right, that makes sense. Yeah. Even up to this point, Kyle and Jim, I still really have to struggle my way through immediate and
Deviate.
the immediate and then the immediate portions before I get a full notion, you know, of each cycle.
Keeps getting me too. He often uses the negative, which I had to realize is mediated.
Yeah. Negative always means mediated. It is the essential. It is the essential portion of the argument of the syllogism that makes up the universal that is the notion, right? And it's the same syllogism that Marx practices, because I realize that you can read his derivation of the universal commodity in chapter 1 as a syllogism that's individual, particular, and then universal, but also you can read it along the dialectical lines of immediate, mediated, and then the full notion of the commodity in its fullness. You know what I mean? Because you start with an immediate exchange relation. You exchange a microphone for a mouse. You equate the two, right? And that's your immediate exchange, right? Or it could just be, I went to the store and I bought a computer and I gave them money. One-to-one exchange. And on the surface, it's immediate and it looks like these things are accidentally related. But what really shows their inner essence, inner relation, is seeing what one commodity to another just generally derives into, right? Isn't that kind of cool? And so in between the immediate, just a single one-to-one exchange, to the final, which is also a one-to-one exchange, but it contains all of the import, you get the mediating syllogisms of the commodity, in which you have the price list, right? You've got like wheat, which will buy this and this and this and this and this and this and this, ad infinitum. There's your bad infinity in the essential categories, right? Isn't that kind of cool? I'm sure necessity is in there somewhere, and I'd have to enumerate it. But the the more I get into this, the more I realize how simple Marx wanted to keep it, in terms of showing us every aspect of what the commodity is and what it does, and then he takes off and says, okay, and this is how the commodity becomes capital, and here's how capital operates, so on and so forth. Oh man, okay. All right, you guys have a great night. Next time we'll talk more about these two chapters, and we'll keep going. Best of luck.
You have a good evening too. Oh, you already dropped. All right, see ya.
Stay away to heaven.
Yeah. All right, see ya.